This week I want to focus on Alan Pivio's dual coding theory. It's based on Baddeley's model of working memory. I presented this before, and as with before, all I want you to remember is that we have two channels for processing information, a visual channel and a verbal channel. The theory: if you process information with similar meaning in both channels, and you connect the processed verbal and visual information in your mind, retention and recall increase significantly. Okay, let's see if we can first identify or define what they mean by information with similar meaning. So if you look at this sign, you notice the cliff, and on the cliff up there, you can see some white patches. And you see the sign and the angle of the sign. So if you're reading this, you'd be looking at the cliff. Well, here's the sign, and what it does is it draws your attention to those white patches, and then it provides information. So what it's doing is you have visual input, looking at the cliff, and you have verbal input, and they match. So there's a lot of visual-verbal overlap, also called high semantic association. Semantic means meaning. So the story being told by the landscape, which a geologist could read, but most people couldn't, it's the same meaning or the same story that's being told on the sign. So here's a more confusing version of dual coding theory. And you'll notice that you have visual stimuli on the top, verbal stimuli on the bottom, and it goes through and it creates imagens from the visual pathway and logogens from the verbal. I don't expect you to remember those two terms. What I do want you to understand is the information is stored differently depending on what channel it comes through. So there is a need to make a referential connection between the two. If you don't make the connection, you don't get the additive properties that lead to increased retention and recall. So these are the referential connections that they're talking about. In a way, learning a language is all about dual coding. We match a word or a series of words to what we perceive. We're looking at a dog. Somebody says that's called a dog, and we're trying to connect the two in our mind to the point where when somebody says dog and we hear it, we can see dog in our mind, or when we see a dog, we can connect it with the word dog, and that's because the two are connected in our mind. We have a referential connection. So that's dual coding theory, really kind of at work on a very basic level. So let me take you to a research project. This is actually the one that I did for my PhD. If you look at the meadow, a couple of things I want you to notice is there's some light-colored grasses in here. Those are sedges. They only grow in very wet areas. They grow in water. And you see pines on the edge, and you see some young pines out in the meadow. And pines don't grow in wet areas. They grow in dry areas. So what does it tell you? Well, it tells you that the meadow is drying out. That's the story that's being told there. That's the meaning if you're looking at that landscape. So I created interpretive panels that told the same story. So there's the same meaning, same story being told, but the one on the bottom has directive language. And by that, it says, like, see the light-colored grass, look at the muddy water, see the young trees. And what the directive language did is it helped people make referential connections. I know this because the retention from reading the bottom sign was significantly higher than reading the top. Okay? Remember, the visual information is out there, and I'm supplying the verbal information. There is a high degree of semantic association, visual-verbal overlap, but the referential connections weren't made. I had to force them to gather the visual information from the environment to make the connection to what I was talking about. Application of dual coding theory. I actually took the same sign and put it in a different setting. I put it in front of a cabin. And aside from people asking me, where's the wetland? People did not look or read the sign. Most people didn't. Those who read it couldn't retain anything because they couldn't match the scene with what they were reading. This is despite the fact that the sign has visual information and it has verbal information. It just couldn't communicate in that particular setting because it didn't tie to the dominant visual. People expect information in close proximity to a visual to be connected. I think it's called the contiguity effect. Anyway, something to remember when you design. So what's the story here? How many of you are amateur geologists or glaciologists? This is Steens Mountain in southeastern Oregon. It is a classic U-shaped valley that's created by a glacier. Again, a geologist can look at this and they can see the story, they can see the meaning. We can't. That particular setting, if you're standing there, it's what I would call the visual context. It's the visual setting in which you're trying to communicate. It's part of a larger sensory context. There's always information that we're gathering by our senses, through our senses, around us. If you consider the exterior environment, and actually interior environments too, all the features are just props for telling us stories because they're a result of something that happened. So you can tell those stories in those locations and people will believe you, they'll understand you. But you can't tell people things they can't see. So trying to tell people a story where it doesn't match with the visual they're looking at, the dominant visual, just doesn't work. Well, but we use visuals all the time. We present them in instructional materials, videos, on websites, newspapers, magazines. Are those just not effective? No, they can be effective. They're just usually not as good because you gather far more information in a real environment than you do from a picture. But these can still be effective. Images that you present provide the visual input, so the associated verbal information must overlap in meaning. This is something I see in captions all the time. Great blue heron wading in a local marsh. Well, that just describes to me what I'm already looking at. And this is actually a comment I put on a lot of your brochure analyses. You're just telling me that information is in bullet points. What does that mean in terms of communication? Well, it means it's making it easier, it's more likely, etc. I was looking for the meaning. You were simply describing to me what I was looking at. Here's the difference. The heron uses its long beak to spear fish and other water creatures that make up its diet. Okay, now I understand why it's standing in water and looking and etc. There's a meaning in the picture and matches the meaning in the verbal information. One other thing I want to mention is concreteness, and that's the ability of a word or phrase to call up an image. All right, so let's talk about abstract versus concrete. Picture justice. How many of you can do that? Well, we can't really because it's too abstract a concept. What we do is we try to picture examples of what we think the word means. And this is actually one of the problems that we have in terms of communication when you're talking about the Constitution or you're talking about the Bill of Rights. It's because there's a lot of abstract words in there that mean different things to different people because they're abstract. They're not concrete. Look at the difference between that and a word like tree. I use the word tree, much more concrete. People call up an image. Now let's talk about vague versus specific. Tree is a concrete word, but look at the difference between that and sequoia, redwood, apple, maple, oak. Much more specific image. Difference between move and dart, dash, slither, plod, sprint, jog. Much better picture words, more concrete. One of the basic rules for writers is to show, don't tell. And they often get accolades like, wow, good writers make the story come alive. It's because they use concrete words, phrases, etc. to show you what's happening. A good novel to me is like a slowly moving picture. I can picture it. It's dual coding theory at work. The words are causing stimulation along both the verbal and the visual pathway. Concreteness and retention. This is supported by research. Concrete verbs, nouns, phrases, paragraphs, sentences, they're retained better for that reason. They're processed along both channels. So, back to the theory. If you process information with similar meaning in both channels, and you connect the processed verbal and visual information in your mind, retention and recall increase significantly. Can't leave any of those out. It's got to be information along both channels, and you have to make sure the connection is made. So what does all that mean in terms of theories that we've talked about before? Well, We know that processing visual information is lower cognitive load, usually clearer communication. It's just quick. Well, we now know that we learn better if we can connect visuals to verbal input in our brain, and by learn better, I mean retain the information. Well, that suggests that what you want to do is communicate the concept visually and use text to support and make sure that there's a high semantic overlap between the two. I can remember in school I was taught to write and then use pictures to break up the text. And what I'm suggesting is use pictures to tell the story and use text in support. It's a different way of looking at things, a different paradigm in a way. Here's some examples of saying it visually. Well, you can tell that the desert's not deserted without even reading the text. In this one, you can tell what they're trying to say is there's thin crust and you can break through and you will get scalded. I think there's an associated sign that says stay on the trail. No words, but they're saying it visually, They're giving you part of the story or the meaning, the basic meaning that something's out of balance visually, and they're using the text to support. So try to say it visually. Think up the visuals that will communicate your message. Use text, though. You need it. You need those symbols so you can have dual coding theory at work. Otherwise, they won't be able to call the information back up because they won't have the label.